All right, we should be live now. Hello, everybody. Thanks for waiting. We're back with our next guest. This is Evan Whiting, who is a PhD student at the University of Minnesota. Is that right?
Yep, that is correct.
Yes, and I believe you study crocodilians and squamates.
Yep, yeah. So I'll be talking a little bit about some of my previous and ongoing work on that. I'll go ahead and start
Sounds good.
sharing
Yeah, go
my
ahead and
screen.
share with us your materials as soon as you have them ready.
Okay. Is that coming through okay? Can everybody
Yes,
see?
I can see them.
Okay, cool. If there's any problems with audio or visual, let me know and I can stop and we can go from there. But all right, so well, thanks for having me on here. You as well as the other organizers have put in a lot of work to pull this event together in a short amount of time. So definitely, thanks to you all for doing this. This is a really great cause that we're trying to support here today and throughout the rest of this weekend, starting on Juneteenth. So. Please, as you're going through and watching the stream, go ahead and donate, send in your questions. I hope to get a lot of questions today, and therefore a lot of donations to support some really important causes. We need to do our best to support Black lives, our Black colleagues, to make sure that they have just as good a chance at having a great life and being involved in paleo as everyone. So. Please donate, and look forward to sharing a little bit about what I do in an effort to help spur that on. So thanks again for having me on here. Is it going? Okay, cool. So like Albert said, I'm currently at Minnesota, but previous to that, I was a master's student at Nebraska and an undergrad at Florida. And sort of my previous work was primarily focusing on alligators from the sort of late Eocene all the way through to modern American alligators. I actually have a modern American alligator skull that I'll bring out sort of towards the latter part of my time slot here, and sort of show off some of their cool anatomical features and adaptations, and hopefully spur a lot of questions and therefore donations on from that. So, but alligators themselves have been around for over 35 million years. There are plenty of crocodilians that existed before that, but the first true alligators occurred in the central Great Plains region of North America in the very late part of the Eocene. They were sort of the last crocodilians standing. There previously had been many more types of crocodilians that existed throughout the western interior from the late Cretaceous and into the Paleogene. But as temperatures cooled and the region became more arid, more dry, you start to see less and less crocodilians until alligators are the last ones standing. Kind of the prime example of that is this guy here on the left. This is a fossil of Alligator prenasalis. That is the first species within the genus that existed in the late Eocene. This specimen that I described was from the sort of northwestern corner of Nebraska. And is a really small individual. I think the scale bar here is only about 1 centimeter, so it's probably a juvenile, but there are definitely larger specimens, none of which approach the size of modern alligators, though, so still relatively small. We don't know exactly what happened in the Oligocene. It seems that alligators kind of dropped out of the Great Plains. It got probably too cold and dry for them. And they don't reappear until the Miocene, about 18 to 20 million years ago, where you have things like this little guy showing up in Nebraska and surrounding states. So that was sort of more of the work I did as a master's student at Nebraska, working with Jason Head, where sort of described and tried to figure out the morphology and identities of these different types of alligators, probably a couple of different species. Most of them are not very complete records. We have a lot of teeth and osteoderms that are sort of isolated that we find, and even though they're not necessarily beautiful skulls like this guy down here, which I'll talk about in a minute, they still are really important sort of occurrence data, occurrence records that tell us when and where alligators were able to occur during this time period, when climatic conditions were a little more favorable for them in the Great Plains region. So not necessarily, again, very complete, but definitely important nonetheless. Even a single tooth can tell us something important about that ecosystem. And down here on the lower right, this is a really beautiful skull, one of many from the Miocene of Florida that I worked on for my undergrad thesis at University of Florida. The American alligator lineage basically has existed in one way or another since at least the late Miocene in Florida and sort of general Gulf Coast region where you find alligators today. They look very similar in the fossil record to their modern counterparts. Some people have argued that there's maybe a few different species that are represented. Other people have argued that it's more kind of an anagenic lineage where it's sort of all one sort of main species. Species, itself, I say in quotes, it's kind of a messy topic in biology and paleontology, especially when you don't necessarily have good character support for any one particular thing if they all look very similar. But regardless, lots of really beautiful fossils preserved primarily in sinkhole deposits, whether those were ponds or rivers. You have, in many cases, nearly complete, beautifully preserved skulls. Some of the time you have articulated skeletons. It's a lot different from the fossils you find in the Great Plains of alligators, which are usually a lot more sort of chunky, and you don't have complete specimens or full skeletons. So probably not just a record of their abundance in the regions, respectively, but also of the likelihood of them being preserved. There's more localities in perhaps Florida where you could preserve them. So, all right. So getting back to the biogeography part, we can look at the records of where these things occur. And again, it can help us inform us about the paleoclimate, and we can use independent paleoclimate proxies from, say, plants or stable isotopes to then have an idea of sort of the climatic conditions that existed in these different regions where you did have alligators. In the Great Plains, there's quite a few fossil localities from the Miocene and Pliocene, in all together the Neogene, that we find. But basically the story is, looking at this plot here on the right, that alligators sort of started to disappear from the Great Plains region as the climate cooled and became more dry in the region, sort of towards the tail end of the Miocene as we lead into the Pliopleistocene and then glaciation. And, obviously it was way too cold at that point for them to be able to hang out there. So really cool sort of story being told in many cases by very, incomplete fossils that are still really important for helping us document these occurrence records. We see here where the modern American alligator range is, kind of throughout the southeastern United States and even a little bit into northeasternmost Mexico. They are predominantly found along the sort of coastal regions, although some of them sort of push inwards along river systems. In Florida, you have alligators that occur today in every single county, and in the fossil record, there's actually quite a distribution as well. But for the next little part of the talk here, I'm going to focus in on alligators and other fossil crocodilians from the sort of north-central region of Florida, not far from Gainesville, the University of Florida. Okay, so one of the other projects I worked on while I was an undergrad at Florida was looking at the potential ecological relationships between alligators and basically their larger, probably more aggressive roommates during the Miocene that they co-occurred with in several localities. These are long-snouted false gharials, tomistomines, represented today by a sole species, the Tomistoma from Southeastern Asia, in Malaysia specifically. In the Miocene, these tomistomines, which have been called various names, Gavialosuchus, Thecacampsa, whatever name you use, they were much larger than their alligator co-inhabitants in these regions. And in some cases, they were exclusively found at a locality, and in some cases they overlapped. Some of these fossils are really large. I've held osteoderms of these Temistamines as big as my hand, and femora that are at least as large as my thigh bone. So probably animals that are pushing 20 to 30 feet long in the Miocene of Florida, which is pretty impressive. So for the project, I was specifically trying to investigate their ecology from a dietary perspective. So I used stable isotope analysis to look at the carbon and oxygen isotope ratios in their teeth. So and I'm not going to get all into what stable isotope analysis is, but essentially you take a sample of tooth enamel, grind it up, and zap it in a mass spectrometer, which analyzes the elemental compositions, in this case of heavy and light carbon and oxygen. And when you plot it out, you can get a good indication of sort of what those relative ratios are to one another. And we can see here there's a really clear distinction between alligators and Temistamines throughout the Miocene of Florida in terms of their carbon isotope values. So they have very different, much more positive carbon values in the Temistamines, much more negative carbon values in the alligators. Basically, the farther to the right you go on this plot and the farther up you go on this plot, the more likely things are feeding and living in marine habitats. So essentially, or at least coastal estuarine habitats. So the Temistamine values here being very positive in both carbon and oxygen actually are pretty close to isotope values for dugongs, the sea cows, from similar localities. So this doesn't mean that they were necessarily eating the dugongs. It'd be pretty cool if that was the case. More likely, based on their very long-snouted morphology, they're probably eating fish, but fish that lived in those same sorts of coastal or estuarine habitats. Whereas the alligators, with their much more negative carbon values, are more likely living in more terrestrial freshwater settings. And even localities like the yellow triangles here for this locality, McGehee Farm, the oxygen isotope values are basically identical, but their carbon isotope values are very different. So in this case, we may have alligators living in a more coastal or estuarine type of habitat, but they're definitely eating very different types of prey items than the Temistamines, which are way over here in carbon values on the other side of the graph. So some really cool evidence and pretty compelling evidence, I think, for ecological niche partitioning within the Miocene of Florida between these two very different types of crocodilians. So a really cool story there. So I just wanted to, that's all I've got for slides, and I'll bring out the alligator skull in a moment, but I just wanted to again, thank you all for listening. I'm not sure how many people are on the stream or whatever, but thank you for being here, and please, donate to Dino Nerds for Black Lives. This is a really important cause, and help supporting a number of charities and organizations that are doing things to make a difference and really help out people who are in need right now. So, and thanks again to Albert and the other organizers for putting this event together. It's really pretty awesome. So thanks.
No problem. That was an excellent presentation. Yeah. Do you want to show us the alligator skull?
Yeah, let me stop sharing.
Good. Seems to be sorted.
Cool. All right. So here we go. We have here, this is a modern American alligator skull.
Yeah.
So probably the first thing you'll notice is it's pretty sort of pockmarked a little bit, or kind of rugose texture.
Yeah.
This is something. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, go. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, and that's this is something that we see kind of increases with age. Some of it is ornamentation, and some of it also has to do with thermoregulation, which I'll talk about in a minute. They have very large eyes, very large orbits. Their eyeballs can kind of tuck into the skull a little bit, which is pretty useful for whenever they're trying to grab a prey animal, or when they're trying to fight each other over something. I don't have the bone here, but alligators and other crocodilians actually have what's called a palpebral bone that kind of sits there and is like an armored eyelid, so they can tuck their eyes in and basically protect themselves when they need to. They also have a sort of third eyelid called a nictitating membrane that they can use as like a pair of swimming goggles that's built in. So that's a pretty cruel adaptation, not something we see on the skull, but they also, as diapsid reptiles, they have two sets of fenestrae or holes behind the eyes, the orbits. So they have the infratemporal fenestrae as well as the supratemporal fenestrae up here on the skull table. There's actually a really cool study that came out last year, I think, where they looked at they use like infrared cameras or heat cameras to see that the supratemporal fenestrae of crocodilians actually play a really important role for thermoregulation. It's just something that may have actually been the case for some dinosaurs as well. So on the sort of back part of the skull, we can see the foramen magnum, where the nerve cord goes into the brain case, the occipital condyle, where the first vertebra attaches, and looking at the bottom of the skull, we can see all of their teeth alveoli. Alligators have around 80 teeth at one time. They replace them constantly throughout their lives, sometimes hundreds, if not thousands of teeth, depending on how much chomping they're doing. And then these sort of flangy-looking bones here are the pterygoids, and these are really important because they actually are where the very strong jaw muscles attach that help give them one of the strongest bite forces of any animal alive today. So yeah,
excellent.
Really cool specimen.
It is fantastic. Yeah.
Really great animals.
That was a very lovely tour of the alligator skull. So let's see if there are any questions. So I have a little bit of time before we have to end here, maybe 3 or 4 minutes before I have to fetch the next guest. So if you have any questions about crocodilians or lizards, please send them in. But yes, that's quite interesting what you mentioned about the rugosity increasing through age. Is that right? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Some of the largest alligator skulls I've seen, and just crocodilian skulls in general, they look like they're kind of like they have wrinkles on their wrinkles.
Right.
Like it's pretty weird. Pretty wild.
Okay, we have a question. Let's see.
Great.
How does the crocodilian diversity of North America during the Neogene compare to other continents such as South America, Australasia, or Europe?
That's a great question. So Neogene diversity in North America is basically less than a handful. So you have alligators in the sort of interior regions during warmer intervals, and along the coasts you have some alligators and the Temistamines, maybe one or two other species of crocodiles that make it up from sort of Central and South America. But overall, the diversity of crocodilians in South America and Africa like blows North America out of the water completely. There's it's hyper diverse. You have at least 5 taxa that co-occur in some localities, especially in northern South America and Colombia, Venezuela. You have just tons of species that have different sort of ecomorphs. They're all sort of eating different things. Some of them have really long, skinny snouts. Some of them have big, broad snouts. There's things that almost look like surfboards. You have the largest caimans, Purosaurus, that were approaching 40, 50 feet long. But none of that in North America, unfortunately. Probably not wet or warm enough.
Right. Makes sense. Yeah, excellent. That should answer the question, I believe. So let's see. Oh, yeah, I think it's almost time that I should go and get our next guest. But thank you so much for being here, Evan. That was a wonderful presentation about your work. And thanks so much for joining us. Hopefully we'll see you around.
Thank you so much for having me on here, and for everybody who's watching. Appreciate it.
Yes, indeed. So I will stop streaming in a moment.